In May of 1942, the first aircraft carrier battle in history would take place in the South Pacific. It would be one of the most confused and confusing battles of all time. And because it was the first duel between aircraft carriers, it would be the first time that neither side's ships sighted or fired directly upon the other. The Battle of Coral Sea is often overshadowed by the more famous Battle of Midway, but nonetheless, its significance cannot be understated. The outcome of this engagement would have direct consequences for the Midway operation. Operation MO called for the invasion of Port Moresby. From there, the Japanese could launch attacks on northern Australia, and it could serve as a launching pad for further incursions into the islands of New Caledonia, the Fijis, and Samoa. Ultimately, what the Japanese wanted to achieve was to cut off Australia's supply lines with the US and hopefully strangle it into submission. For this operation, they needed air support, so Admiral Yamamoto reluctantly agreed to lend 2 of his carriers. He wanted them back as soon as the operation was completed because he needed them for the upcoming Midway offensive. As was typical in Japanese operational planning, the operation was unnecessarily complex. First, Tulagi would be taken on May 3rd, while receiving air cover from the Carrier Strike Force and a covering force under Rear Admiral Goto, which contained a light carrier and 4 cruisers. A seaplane base would be set up for air reconnaissance. Goto's covering force would then head north and team up with the invasion convoy that would have departed Rabaul on May 4th. The 6-day voyage would pass through the Jomard Passage. Additional seaplane bases would be set up along the way to supplement the air searches. This was a dangerous stretch for the Japanese, since they would be subjected to air raids from land-based bombers based in Australia. But no worries, that's what the Carrier Strike Force was there for, to provide air cover. And finally, on May 10th, the invasion party would land and Port Moresby would be taken. But as you can see, the plan relied on perfect coordination with 5 separate groups. The Japanese were depending on encountering a passive enemy who would follow the Japanese script. If they were to run into any determined counterattack, their plan was surely unbound. In regards to enemy opposition, the Japanese were optimistic. At most, there could be 2 American carriers present, but they weren't counting on it. And if they showed up, Vice Admiral Takagi was confident his own carriers would make easy work of them. Plus, they also had surprise on their side. Well, sort of. Because little did they know, the Americans were completely aware of the upcoming invasion. At this stage of the war, the greatest American weapon was their radio intelligence. Thanks to skilled US Navy codebreakers, enough pieces and fractions of messages were deciphered that a rough timeline for the operation was made available to the Americans. However, to meet the Japanese, the Americans had only 1 carrier available, the USS Yorktown. The US Navy had 5 carriers in the Pacific at this stage in the war. 1 had been torpedoed and were being repairs for several months. 2 were coming back from the recent Doolittle raid and were unavailable. So, they could only reinforce the Yorktown with 1 more, the old but reliable USS Lexington. The American plan was simple: stay at the edge of Japanese air range and launch counterattacks when deemed suitable. The Americans relied not only on Australian bombers to conduct their air searches, but also on their own scout planes. The Japanese differed from this doctrine. They strictly used their own carrier aircraft for offensive capabilities, not scouting. Thus, they solely relied on land-based aircraft, seaplanes, and flying boats to do all of the reconnaissance. Their seaplanes had an extraordinary range of 3,000 miles, meaning they could search up to 1,000 miles. Still, this wasn't enough. In war, one must do his utmost to get the most accurate reconnaissance. The one who can spot the enemy first and spot them accurately is the one who gets to strike first and thus achieve victory. Keep in mind that weather could play an important role during air searches. Whoever operated under cloud cover had an advantage. It gave them protection from enemy reconnaissance, and it would make it difficult for the enemy aviators to attack them. During the first days of the battle, the Americans would benefit from this. If there is something to be learned from this battle, it's that reliable reconnaissance is key. You'll see how it will fail both sides in the following days. There were 5 separate groups for Operation MO, including 2 invasion convoys. A light carrier, the Shoho, would provide air cover for each of the invasion forces, but it was the carrier striking force that provided the main punch. It was composed of the Shokaku and the Zuikaku. Together they had 121 aircraft. It was under the command of Vice Admiral Takagi. but tactical control was given to Rear Admiral Hera, a veteran of naval aviation warfare. The Americans had Task Force 17 with the Yorktown in the South Pacific. It would later be reinforced with an Australian-American cruiser force under the command of Rear Admiral Crace, Royal Navy. Once the Lexington arrived, the two carriers would have 134 planes between them. Rear Admiral Fletcher was in command, but tactical control was given to Rear Admiral Fitch. The preliminary phase. On May 2nd, Fletcher was waiting to rendezvous with the Lexington. However, Lexington needed to refuel. Intelligence reports indicated to Fletcher that Operation Emma was beginning, so he headed north alone at a slow pace. At 1900 hours, he got a report of the Tulagi invasion force making its way towards Tulagi. He decided to launch an attack on his own. He increased his speed and headed north. Although attacking the landing force on Tulagi would reveal the presence of a US carrier in the area to the Japanese, Fletcher deemed it justified if he could deliver a punishing blow. The next day, on May 4th, Fletcher launched an early morning strike. He was under some protection because he was operating under heavy weather. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise and were practically defenseless. 3 attacks in total were launched throughout the day. Despite such a large amount of ordnance being dedicated to this attack, the damage was modest. And in spite of the attack, the Tulagi seaplane base would be operating 2 days later. On May 5th, Fletcher met up with the Lexington and the cruiser force. They topped off on fuel, and on the 6th, Fletcher combined all the forces at hand into one enlarged Task Force 17. Fletcher had correctly deduced that the invasion force was going to pass through the Jomard Passage, so they began to head northwest, but only after they had sent their only oiler and her escort to the south to a designated safe area. He thought the carriers were in the Bougainville area. They were probably going to head south to guard the left flank of the convoy. Boy, he couldn't have been more wrong. The Japanese carriers were actually on his exposed flank, coming right at him and within striking distance. But let's see how they got here in the first place. To minimize the chances of discovery, the Port Moresby operation called for the carrier strike force to conduct a wide sweep around the Solomon Islands so that they could enter Coral Sea from the east. However, a seemingly simple mission had given loads of trouble to the carriers. They were tasked with ferrying 9 Zeros to Rabaul to strengthen the airbase there. On the 2nd of May, the fighters set off, but bad weather forced them to return. They tried again on the 3rd, and again they had to return due to bad weather. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful, and this 2-day delay is what made them be here instead of here, where they could have possibly launched a counterstrike against the Yorktown. Anyways, the strike was a shock for the Japanese, and to complicate things more, Takagi was in the middle of refueling when he received the news of the attack. He ceased fueling and headed south immediately in pursuit, but by then, Fletcher was long gone. On the evening of May 5th, Takagi turned west into Coral Sea, where he planned to refuel on the 6th. It must be noted that even at this point, given the tactical situation of there being an enemy carrier on the loose, the Japanese carriers were still not launching their own searches. Instead, they waited passively for reports from land-based aircraft. Actually, on May 5th, a flying boat appeared in the vicinity of Task Force 17 but was shot down. The crew either sent no message or did, but it failed to reach Takagi. Nevertheless, the failure of this aircraft to return gave the Japanese a vague notion of where the American carriers might be. And so, as it came to be, on the 6th of May, the Japanese were in a perfect position to launch an ambush on the unsuspecting Americans. While the Americans incorrectly searched to the north, the Japanese correctly searched to the west. At 1000 hours, a flying boat spotted Task Force 17. But once again, Takagi was caught in the middle of refueling when he received the report. By noon, he was heading south in pursuit. However, by the evening, enthusiasm had fallen. There was bad weather. It was getting late, and he roughly knew where the American carriers were, but he didn't want to send a search to confirm it, because he feared that it would alert the Americans to his presence. So he decided not to rush it. It would be better to launch a comprehensive search the following day, locate the enemy, and launch a powerful strike to finish the carriers. And so Hera called off the pursuit. Unbeknownst to him, if he had been more aggressive this day, it would have paid off handsomely. Post-battle analysis would later reveal that the Japanese carriers got within 70 miles of Task Force 17 that day. 70 miles! The report that Hera originally had received was incorrect, but to his advantage, it was actually some 50 miles closer. If he had launched a search, he surely would have found the Americans. And if he had launched a strike that evening, he would have found Task Force 17 in a vulnerable state, since they would have been in the middle of refueling. The Battle of Coral Sea would have ended right then and there with a total Japanese victory. Hera and Takagi's timidity and lack of aggression this day cost them their best chance for a victory. Both sides were ready to give battle on the 7th. The MO striking force still had the advantage of surprise. They searched west and south, while Task Force 17, ignorant of the real Japanese position, searched north. In case the carrier battle didn't go well for the Americans, a task force of 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers under Rear Admiral Crace departed to block the convoy that would pass Jomard Passage. By this point, Hera had unenthusiastically launched 12 of his own Kates to boost the search. In order to safeguard his flank, he extended their southwest search to also search south. This decision would prove rather unfortunate. Hera's search planes got a sighting in this sector at 7:22. An American carrier and a cruiser were spotted. Hera hesitated, but a second plane confirmed the sighting at 7:45. By 08:15, Hera had launched a massive strike of 78 planes. However, minutes after the launch, he got another sighting of American carriers, 150 miles northwest. Turns out his original sighting was incorrect. Unbelievably, both search planes committed the same mistake and misidentified the 2 ships. Hera had just committed his strike against the wrong target. He declined to recall the strike. He didn't want to break radio silence, and he hoped there would be other targets of some value. The planes reached the target area, found the oiler Neosho, which by the way was a Pearl Harbor survivor, and the destroyer Sims. Both had left Fletcher the day before. The pilots spread out and wasted 2 hours searching for more valuable targets, and of course they found none. So they finally settled on these 2 secondary targets. At 15 past 12, the Sims was hit by 3 bombs. The destroyer split in half and sank with a heavy loss of life. The remaining dive bombers went for Neosho, and she was hit by 7 bombs. She survived for 4 more days and was eventually scuttled. The Japanese strike arrived late that afternoon. The launching of a second strike this late in the day was doubtful. However, the attack didn't compromise their position. Only Neosho had sent word at 10:21 that it was under attack by 3 planes. But these could have been long-range aircraft from Tulagi, so Fletcher was still unaware that the carriers were on his flank. Eerily, the Americans were practically committing the Japanese's exact mistakes. Fletcher's dawn search resulted in a sighting at 08:15. A report of 2 carriers and 4 cruisers was given. He launched a strike of 93 aircraft at 9:26. Soon, the pilot that made the sighting landed on board the Yorktown and revealed that he had never spotted 2 carriers. Turns out his coding device had a malfunction, and when he reported 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers, it came out as 2 carriers and 4 cruisers. Therefore, by about 10:15, the situation was that both carrier forces had simultaneously launched their strikes against the wrong targets. Just like Takagi, Fletcher declined to recall the strike. It pressed on. However, the American strike fared better when the report at 10:22 indicated the presence of at least 1 carrier there. Here you realize the foolishness in not delaying the rest of the MO operation, since the carrier striking force was behind schedule for 2 days. The vulnerable convoy had been advancing this whole time with practically no air cover except for the Shoho. The invasion force knew it had been spotted with all the sightings of aircraft overhead, so it pulled back north, but it was too late. A gap was formed between the Shoho and its protective screen of cruisers. The Shoho was in very clear weather. Her 18 aircraft would be no match against the 93 that were coming her way. Lexington's air group was spotted at 10:50. Shoho had only 3 fighters in the air. Shoho made a turn to port. She skillfully dodged the first 3 bombs. Then, the next 10 bombs. She launched another 3 fighters to boost her defense. However, her luck ran out. 15 dive bombers came and scored a hit. Then another 1,000-pound bomb hit the ship. Torpedo bombers conducted an anvil attack and hit her with 5 torpedoes. The ship was now crippled. The Yorktown squadrons came next at 11:25. They should have ignored her and gone for other targets, but they didn't. They landed another 5 to 6 more hits on the carrier and another 2 to 5 torpedo hits. In total, they had overkill on this carrier with about 12 hits and 7 torpedoes. At 11:31, abandon ship was ordered. All 18 planes were lost either by ditching or being destroyed, all for the loss of 3 American aircraft. The Shoho had a heavy loss of life and was the first Japanese carrier to be sunk in the war. The invasion force dispersed in terror, and all the forces not involved with dealing with the American carriers were ordered to temporarily withdraw north. Fletcher's force was recovered by 1316, but he was hesitant to launch a second strike against the convoy because he still didn't know where the main Japanese force was. He knew of the loss of the Sims and the Neosho, but that still didn't pinpoint the exact location of the carriers. Also on the 7th, Crace's cruiser force was spotted and attacked by a force of 31 bombers and 11 fighters in the afternoon. Luckily, none of the ships were hit. He was even attacked by 3 friendly B-17s by accident, but also survived that without a scratch. The Japanese heard about Shoho's loss and were eager for revenge. With the number of aircraft involved during the Shoho attack, it was clear that 2 carriers were on the loose. Only now were the Japanese inclined to take risk. They decided to make a dusk attack, a long-range search and destroy mission with their best pilots. Based on a sighting at 16:15, they sent 27 bombers to search west. Mind you, these pilots have just returned from a 7-hour mission and were exhausted. The strike was launched, but the weather was terrible, and they ended up missing the Americans. American radar detected the flight and an ambush was set up on a portion of them. 9 were shot down. The rest continued their mission, unaware that they had passed the enemy fleet. They finally gave up, jettisoned their bombs and torpedoes to lighten their weight, and headed back home. And it was only on the return trip that they run into the Americans, but they didn't have their bombs anymore. And something noteworthy happened. In all the confusion settling that night, some Japanese aircraft actually tried to land on the Yorktown, thinking it was their own carrier. They quickly sped away when they received anti-aircraft fire. Hera turned on his searchlights and the remaining 18 were able to land. But the loss of 9 bombers and their elite pilots in this desperate attempt would be sorely missed the next day. The carriers were about 100 miles away from each other at 2000 hours. Fletcher finally knew the location of the carriers. The Japanese trump card of surprise had been thrown away. In the 24-hour period that straddled the 6th and the 7th, the Japanese lost 2 good opportunities to force battle on the American carriers when the odds were in their favor. On the afternoon of the 6th, had the Japanese attacked, they would have found the Americans in the process of refueling. And on the 7th, the Japanese were on the rear of a distracted enemy and squandered their chance by launching their strike against secondary targets. Had they found and attacked Task Force 17 and not the Neosho and the Sims, the Japanese would have caught them by surprise while they were attacking the Shoho. And so now, battle was assured for the 8th. The Japanese would now give battle more or less on the basis of equality and with an enemy alerted to their presence. This day, Lady Luck was on the Japanese side as cloud cover had moved and was now over the Japanese force. Both Fletcher and Takagi found what they were looking for. The Americans launched a full 360-degree search at 0625. And at 0820, the Japanese were spotted 175 miles away. On this day, Fletcher had 117 operational aircraft. He dispatched a striking force of 75 planes. By 0925, the 2 air groups proceeded separately. The Japanese search aircraft were launched at 0615 and made a spotting at 0822. The MO striking force had fewer aircraft, 95 operational planes, but managed to put together a strike of 69 planes. Almost simultaneously, both strikes occurred. The Yorktown dive bombers spotted the Japanese carriers at 10:32. They decided to wait for the torpedo bombers to catch up, but it wasn't worth it. This 20-minute delay allowed the Zuikaku to disappear under the clouds. Also, this allowed more Japanese fighters to be launched to strengthen the air defense. At 10:57, the attack finally commenced. The planes of Yorktown and Lexington attacked separately, and Shokaku, being the only carrier visible, took the brunt of the entire attack. The first 7 bombs missed. Then came 17 dive bombers. A bomb struck the bow, which started a fire. The rest of the squadron followed. One of her pilots, Lieutenant John J. Powers, with his aircraft already damaged, dived well below 1,000 feet to ensure a hit. He wasn't able to pull out the dive in time, and both he and his rear gunner were killed. His bomb hit shattered the flight deck of the Shokaku. His bravery earned him a posthumous Medal of Honor. The torpedo bombers came next and launched from extreme range, and all of them missed. By 11:05, Shokaku had been hit by 2 bombs and was popping in and out of cloud cover. Half an hour later came Lexington's strike. However, 14 planes never even made it to the target because they got lost in the bad weather, so only 22 made the attack. 4 dive bombers came and scored 1 hit at 11:40. The remaining 12 torpedo bombers came and launched their torpedoes, but again, they all missed. By 11:50, the attack was over. It was a poor performance. Although they managed to strike the Shokaku with 3 heavy 1,000-pound bombs, she was in no immediate danger of sinking. The attack had cost the Americans 2 dive bombers and 3 Wildcats. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol lost only 2 fighters. After the attack, the Shokaku had to depart the area, leaving the Zuikaku as the sole carrier. The Japanese attack differed greatly in coordination and precision. Warrant Officer Kanyo Kenzo, the pilot who made the original sighting, was on his way back to his carrier. He made a heroic sacrifice by turning back to lead the strike accurately to its target. This spelled a death sentence for him and his crew, who now wouldn't have enough fuel to return. His plane would be shot down shortly after the battle. For their bravery, the 3 men would be awarded a posthumous letter of commendation, personally signed by Admiral Yamamoto. Radar detected the Japanese strike at 10:55. They were 68 miles out. The Americans sent 5 fighters to intercept them, but they missed them. Remember that radar interception was in its infancy at this stage of the war. The Japanese were to launch a superior coordinated strike with both their torpedo and dive bombing squadrons. Of the 18 Kates, 14 selected the Lexington, and 4 would go for the Yorktown. Of the 33 dive bombers, 19 went for the Lexington and 14 for the Yorktown. A wave of anti-aircraft fire greeted the Japanese, and the Lexington turned to starboard. The Lexington was able to avoid damage for several minutes, once even allowing a pair of torpedoes to pass her on both sides. At 11:20, her luck ran out against the torpedoes, and she was hit in quick succession by 2 on her port side. Dive bombers got 2 hits on the Lexington, but overall, the dive bombing attack caused minor damage. Although the Lexington had suffered 2 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits, she could still conduct flight operations and keep at a good 24 knots. The Yorktown was more maneuverable and was able to dodge all the torpedoes. But she was hit by a 500-pound bomb, and it went through 6 decks before finally exploding. Despite the effort of 20 Wildcats and 23 Dauntlesses on combat air patrol, Japanese losses were light. 5 dive bombers and 8 torpedo bombers were lost to the Americans. American losses were 3 Wildcats and 5 Dauntlesses. However, on the return trip, the Japanese had to ditch 7 aircraft, and 12 more were thrown off the decks after they had landed. So in total, Japanese suffered more losses during the 8th. The MO Striking Force lost 34 aircraft in combat, as opposed to 19 for Task Force 17. But there was trouble on the Lexington. As the day went on, her condition grew worse, as explosions rattled the ship. There was an explosion at 12:47, then a huge one at 14:42, and then a third one at 15:25. Soon, fires began to spread uncontrollably throughout the carrier. It was then clear that she wouldn't be saved. After the crew had been rescued, the carrier was scuttled. Of her crew of 2,951, 216 men died. The Lexington took with her 35 aircraft still on board, leaving the Yorktown with only 39 aircraft. Fletcher had no option but to withdraw. This battle had already cost the Pacific Fleet 1/4 of its carrier's strength. But on the flip side, the Japanese situation also didn't look promising. The Zuikaku was left with, oddly enough, 39 operational planes. Fuel was down because of all the fuel interruptions, pilots were fatigued, and with this low aircraft strength, the carrier striking force was not capable of supporting the invasion force, so they wisely pulled back. The battlefield did lay in Japanese hands. The Japanese could have pushed forward and taken Port Moresby with little opposition. All that was left were Army land-based bombers who posed little threat to ships underway at sea. But again, this is hindsight. Back then, it would have been ludicrous to send a vulnerable convoy without sufficient air cover. Operation MO was over. Casualties were as follows for the Allied forces. The Americans lost the Lexington, a valuable fleet oiler, and a destroyer. 66 planes were lost and personal casualties were at 543. For the Japanese, they lost a light carrier, a destroyer, and several auxiliaries. The Japanese lost 77 planes and 1,074 men. The Japanese lost 90 aircrew compared to the Americans who lost only 35. But strictly speaking in tonnage and material loss, the Japanese had a tactical victory here. But it was a strategic victory for the Americans because it had stopped the first Japanese offensive since the beginning of the war, and it prevented the Port Moresby invasion. The Japanese would later try to take Port Moresby overland, and it would fail. The threat to Australia was put away for good. Equally important was that this engagement had knocked off 2 carriers off the order of battle for the upcoming Midway operation. The Americans had devastated Zuikaku's air group and damaged the Shokaku, so that ultimately, none would be able to participate in Midway. This could have been offset though if the Japanese had been luckier. On May 8th, only 4 torpedo bombers went after the Yorktown. 8 more could have been added to this attack if they hadn't been lost in the desperate night mission the day before. Had the Japanese placed a single torpedo hit on the Yorktown, history would have been altered. Even if the Yorktown had survived, she certainly would not have been repaired in time to participate in the Midway battle, where, as we know, her aircraft would end up playing an important role. Instead, it would now just be 4 carriers for the Midway operation. Oh well, they should be able to handle themselves. Yamamoto was confident in his forces.